Good afternoon, and thanks to everyone for coming for today's lecture, which has been organized by the Bhusambhara Center at NIAS in honor of Professor Madhav Gadgil, as you all know, who recently passed away. We are very happy to have with us today to give this memorial lecture Professor Sharad Chandra Lele, also known as Sharad, who is currently a Distinguished Fellow in Environment, Policy and Governance at A3 here in Bangalore. He is also an honorary professor at Shiv Nada University, Delhi. I'm going to just say a few words about Professor Lele because I know he's going to give a little bit more in his talk about his career and his interactions with Professor Gadgil over the years. Professor Lele received his BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Bombay. And in his bio note, he tells us that it was after listening to Madhav Gadgil speak about dams and the environment in 1983 that he decided that environmental studies was a more exciting and socially relevant field to go into. So he joined IIC here and for his master's, becoming the first student to register for courses in the ecology and environmental science program in the newly formed Center for Ecological Sciences. After completing his MS on the environmental impacts of large dams, he went on to pursue PhD in energy and resources at UC Berkeley, for which he studied forest use in the Western Ghats. Sharad Lele is a well-known, of course, really needs no introduction, but a well-known interdisciplinary environmental researcher whose career has been spent trying to bridge the natural sciences, economics, and political science in understanding the concepts and pathways to environmental sustainability and socially just development. His research interests include issues in sustainable development, sustainability, and the analysis of institutional, economic, and ecological and technological issues in forest, energy, and water resource management. He has worked on sustainable forest management, forest governance, forest hydrology, farmer linkages, water resource management, watershed development, and many other topics um, um, one can see on his CV. He is interested in understanding the interactions between the nature of environmental problems and the structures of governance used to address them, and exploring questions of law, science, and bureaucratic accountability in the functioning of these governance structures. Apart from ATRI, Shadat has worked at the Pacific Institute, Harvard University, and the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Environment and Development. He has served on the MOEF MOTA Forest Rights Act Committee, Karnataka High Court's Elephant Task Force, the Bellandur Lake Expert Committee, and the MOEF's Expert Appraisal Committee for Coal Mining and Thermal Power Plant, among many other duties over the years. He has led many projects, which I will not list here, and of course also has a long list of publications, both scholarly and especially importantly, writings in popular media, which bring many of these issues to public notice. So I welcome Professor Lele Tinias and invite him to deliver his lecture, which is entitled Forestry, Diversity, and Eco-Development, Madhav Gadgil's Ecosystem of Ideas.
Thank you, Carol, and a special thanks to Nias and specifically to the Bhusampada program for giving me this opportunity to say a few words about the late Professor Madhav Gadgil. I always seen him as my mentor, even though our interactions sort of varied over time depending upon his interests and mine as they moved in the last 30, 40 years. As many of you know, Professor Madhav Gadgil, when you met him, he would always invite you to speak to him on a first name basis, and he would say, "My name is Madhav." And all the students in CES, when I spent time in the Center for Ecological Sciences way back in 1989, 90, or before that, we all addressed him as Madhav. Although privately, when I spoke to him in Marathi, I would be slightly more respectful and say Madhav Rao. For the purposes of this lecture, I will stick to the English form of addressing him as Madhav. This lecture is not an obituary. I'm sure Madhav would not be really in favor of obituaries or eulogies. It's also not meant to provide a comprehensive summary of Madhav's very wide-ranging interests, ideas, and contributions. I think if we try to do that kind of a comprehensive summary, we would be here for many hours and would require many different speakers to really do justice to that. What I propose to do in the next 45 minutes or so that I have is to engage with a few key ideas of his from that complex ecosystem that he had created over 5 decades of work. Some of the ideas that I think are less well known, but I think are really important, not just in the work that he did, but even in the contemporary context. And in order to sort of think about them today, we might need to understand them more deeply, nuance them, maybe even modify them, challenge a few of their elements, but still I think they are extremely important in today's context. Of course, in doing this kind of an exercise, I will be speaking from my particular vantage point, based upon his work that I know best and where our interests overlap. So what is that vantage point? I first met Madhav, as Carol said, when I was a student doing my BTech in electrical engineering in IIT Bombay. And I had decided that engineering was not really my cup of tea. I saw most of my contemporaries going abroad and not returning. It seemed like a real waste of government's resources to take that degree and then disappear. It also seemed particularly removed from the kind of social problems around us. And I would credit the 1982 Citizens Report on the State of India's Environment, to which Madhav was also a contributor, for that change in my thinking in terms of moving from bird watching and wildlife watching as a hobby to environmental studies as something that I would like to do in the long run in my life. And so looking for this a way forward, how do I switch from engineering to environmental studies? I was lucky enough that Madhav came to IIT Bombay to give a talk on dams and the environment in 1983. So after the talk, I went up to him and said, how do I make this switch? And in his typical style, he said, it's fine, just come over to the Indian Institute of Science and we'll figure something out. Of course, easier said than done. So I had to figure out a pathway into IISc with a BTech in electrical engineering. So I applied to the Department of Computer Science. In those days, it was just called School of Automation. And there was a professor there, Professor D.K. Subramaniam, willing to work on dams. So that was kind of my entry into IISc. 1984, I was enrolled there. At that time, actually, CES did not exist. CES was formed, the Center for Ecological Sciences, in towards the end of my first semester. And as Carol said again, my second semester, I was the first enrolled student in courses offered by the Center for Ecological Sciences. I was the only student in that course. Ranjit Daniels was auditing that course alongside me. So we were two people sitting in the room most of the time. And we had Madhav's sort of full attention, teaching us population ecology and evolution. And then we had Niranjan Joshi, Raghavendra Gadakar, and several others who were in the center at that time. Sukumar also gave a few lectures. So that was my first exposure to Madhav as a teacher. And I was toying for a while with the idea of switching from my master's in automation to doing a PhD in the Center for Ecological Sciences. But I realized soon that that time Madhav's interests, the topics that he was interested in, were very theoretical and sort of game theory and so on. And my own inclination was more empirical. There was also not really a cohort. CES was, and I think remains today, firmly rooted in the biological sciences. And my interests have always been wider, and I was kind of struggling to find a peer group. So I left the Institute of Science with a master's and joined UC Berkeley for a PhD. But as luck would have it, in 1988, Madhav came to Berkeley to give a lecture. And then we got talking afterwards, and he said, why don't you come down and work in the Shirsi field station? We have gathered a lot of data during our studies in the Western Ghats. So I was again a visiting student this time at IISc and working in the Shirsi field station for my PhD dissertation. I should mention that my introduction to the Western Ghats came during my master's days because of Madhav. And I mean the Karnataka Western Ghats. I had been trekking in the Maharashtra part of the Western Ghats for a while as a school kid, but to this much more diverse, much more forested, much more, I would say, in some ways, fascinating landscape. The introduction happened because Madhav organized a trek in Uttar Kannada, Shirsi, Matigatta region in 1984 winter. And J. Srinivasan, Ranjit Daniels, and several others joined us on that trek. And that was really an eye-opener for me. It introduced me to the varied landscape, including the Ereka Gardens and the associated forests and paddy lands of that region. And then, coincidentally, I was later to do my PhD in that landscape. The PhD work that I did in between 89 and 91 in the field and completed later on was part of an ongoing 5-year project that CES had called Eco-Development of Microcatchments. And I will come back to this particular topic a bit later. But that was really the time when CES was engaged very heavily in the field, along with other members from IISc as well as the Karnataka Council for Science and Technology, in implementing eco-development oriented work in the villages of Uttar Kannada. But by the time I came back from 1995, the eco-development phase had passed, and Madhav had switched interests much more heavily into the area of biodiversity conservation, and almost exclusively spending his time running what he called the Western Ghats Biodiversity Network. Whereas my interests remained in the area of forest rights, livelihoods, and sort of sustainable use. So professionally, we didn't really interact a whole lot between 95 and almost 2017, I would say, when he got fully involved in supporting communities in eastern Maharashtra, Gadchiroli and elsewhere, uh, to manage their forests under the community forest rights that they had got under the FRA. And I had also started expanding my FRA work into central India. So it was kind of when we started interacting. Of course, not interacting professionally does not mean that you're not aware of Madhav's work. Being such a stalwart in the field, you would always be reading what he wrote. And once I started teaching, I could not help but use a lot of Madhav's writings on various subjects in the teaching that I was doing. So on the basis of my observations of Madhav's work, and I'm happy to say that this is actually turns out to be corroborated by something that Ram Guha wrote about 10 years ago. I would offer this broad periodization of Madhav's work in this area of environmental studies. Of course, we know that his PhD work is much more in sort of theoretical population ecology and so on. I'm not talking about that. But in the kind of work that I'm talking about, it begins in the 1970s with his work with on the question of caste and ecological niches and folk traditions of conservation. In the 1980s, he moves into a critique of forest policy, as well as this work on eco-development in the Western Ghats. Then in the sort of mid-90s onwards, he moved into, as I mentioned, the work on biodiversity assessment and conservation. And this took him pretty much till 2010, when he was invited to chair the Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel by the Minister of Environment. And the report writing, as well as subsequently the debates that emerged around it, the additional report that was commissioned by the ministry and the back and forth between the two committees occupied a lot of his time during this period. And then the last phase, I feel, has been his work on community forest resource management, primarily in Maharashtra, associated partly with the Maharashtra Gene Bank project that he also led from 2012 onwards for about 10 years. So that's been kind of, I think, it's a very rough periodization. It's also not meant to be compartmentalized. I mean, a lot of the strands were overlapping, and Madhav being Madhav, doing many things at the same time. It's also not meant to be entirely comprehensive. He had a much wider set of interests that is not captured here. I will be focusing on a subset of this period. And the reason is because I think when we look at these sort of five strands in his work, and then read the obituaries today that were published, say, over the last 2 or 3 months, you will see that everybody has mentioned the Western Ghats report. And he sort of focused almost entirely on the report and the prescience with which he wrote some of the challenges that the Western Ghats faced and the risks of unabated development that have now come out to be true in terms of intense rainfall and its impacts in terms of landslides and so on. So a lot of the attention, and of course the younger generation knows of Madhav through that very, shall we say, well-known, slightly controversial Western Ghats report, and especially the controversies that emerged from the field for a variety of reasons around that report. So my submission is that while all of us perhaps know that part of Madhav's work really well, it would be unfair to be so dazzled by the report and its aftermath that we forget about his other contributions, which I think are also equally salient, and perhaps in a sense because the report was more policy oriented, whereas his other contributions are at a slightly more conceptual level that we need to also engage with and understand understand their relevance in today's context. So I'm going to be focusing on primarily the critique of forest policy, the eco-development work and idea, and the biodiversity assessment questions. The link with CFR management, of course, will emerge as I talk about it. I'm not necessarily going to follow the same chronological sequence. I will begin, however, with the critique of scientific forestry. And I think for many of you, if you have read the book that he wrote with Ram Guha, the first book, The Fissured Land, this diagram, which originally came in the 1978 report on the depletion of bamboo resources in Karnataka that he co-authored with his student S.N. Prasad, has been actually become sort of iconic. It's also reproduced in the 1982 Citizens Report. And this is basically about the sequential depletion of bamboo resources of Karnataka by the paper industry. The paper industry received bamboo at highly subsidized rates while it was being sold at high prices to traditional craftspeople. And the sequential exhaustion that he documented, starting from the original supply area around the paper mill, and how they, having wiped out those bamboo resources, had to go further and further away, and in some cases all the way to Meghalaya to import bamboo into, to meet their requirements, is very well documented in this report. And the reasons for this to happen was a combination of wrong estimates of the productivity of bamboo, poor monitoring of what the industry was actually doing in terms of harvesting practices, and of course the insecure tenure that the industry faced, subsidized prices and short-term leases, so that they felt it was rational to, in a sense, plunder the resource and make the most of it, and not really worry about sustainable use. So they have documented this in great detail. They've gone a lot into the ecology of bamboo also, and how the prescriptions that were given for managing bamboo themselves, in a sense, unscientific or not grounded in a scientific understanding of the way bamboo grows. Very soon after that, you see a broader critique by Madhav, Rauf Ali, and S.N. Prasad in this report, on this paper that they wrote, following a report for the Central Ministry. This was a committee constituted to look into the pine plantation project in Bastar district. Now, I think for most of you would know that Bastar is in central India, and the forests in Bastar district are basically sal forests, moist evergreen, or dry deciduous forests, sometimes dominated by teak. And pine is completely foreign as it comes from the Himalayas. But this was a brilliant project conceived under World Bank funding in the name of social forestry, in the name of improving the productivity of Indian forests, to actually carve out a 5,000 hectares of land and convert it into pine plantations. It started with a pilot experiment, and starting with that, their observations on that pilot experiment, they have written a broader critique of so-called scientific forestry in the country, where the claim of scientific forestry is that it promotes sustained yield in the national interest, whereas the reality is that the interest that is pursued is very narrow, basically timber production, and the methods that are used are unscientific in terms of determining what will work and what will not work in the landscape. And the first point about the narrow and biased nature of the objectives, you see that the focus being on timber production, then of course local users of these forests who have been there for millennia are considered as interlopers and banned from entering reserve forests, whether it is for grazing, collecting firewood, or meeting other kinds of needs, except as and when the forest department might allow. And in the initial period, starting from the British period and extending all the way to the 1970s, you see that one strategy employed by the forest departments was clear felling. Basically, clear-cut natural forests and replace it with plantations. And the plantations were teak, pine, and then later on, starting in the 1950s, eucalyptus, and more recently, starting in the 1980s, Acacia auriculaformis. And this is really something that they have documented in detail how this has happened. But more importantly, they studied the productivity of these plantations, taking them at face value, saying, fine, if you want to replace natural forests with eucalyptus plantations, because your goal is to produce pulp for the paper industry. How are you doing even with respect to that very narrow goal? And what they showed is that the productivity of these plantations was far below what had been predicted at the time of taking the decision to go down that road. And it's also important for us to understand the scale on which this has happened. And so my work a little bit on the mapping of land cover in the Western Ghats region, particularly in the Uttar Kannada region, shows that if you zoom in on the landscape, these clear fell patches, which are shown here in the hatched legend, were really ubiquitous. They had basically felled natural forest completely, and you can see these square, rectangular, or very sharply delineated edges where these plantations have been created. Initially teak, and later on eucalyptus. And when I was doing my fieldwork for my PhD, I would visit these plantations. There was basically nothing else there, and the plants, the trees themselves were not doing very well. Especially the eucalyptus was failing in the face of very high rainfall in the Western Ghats, and of course, as Madhav's report documented, also suffering from the pink disease. So the scale at which this has happened, for example, a later study that we did of all of Karnataka, we looked at the lands controlled by the forest department, and 15% of the lands controlled by the forest department in Karnataka are actually monocultural plantations, which is a very significant fraction of the landscape that they are managing for in terms of their so-called conservation objectives. And as I said, Gadgil et al. Showed that these plantations had by and large failed. Their productivity was somewhere between 14 to 40% of the predicted or projected yield, especially in the Western Ghats region that they sampled quite heavily. The second strategy that has been employed under scientific forestry is, of course, what is called selection felling. And for those of us who are not familiar with forestry jargon, it basically means setting a girth cutoff and saying any tree larger than this girth we will fell if it has timber value. And the assumption is that 15 years later or 20 years later, when we come back to that plot, there will be some more trees that will have crossed into that particular girth threshold, and then we will fell only those trees. So in a sense, you can say that, well, it leaves the younger trees intact and only captures the mature trees. So Madhav's point here is that this method might have been fine in the much less diverse forests of Europe, but it's much harder to implement in the diverse forests, whether it's of the Western Ghats or Central India or the Himalayas, where there is a complex nature of community dynamics that is between different species. The kind of successional patterns that you see are not something that you can predict. You can just sort of selectively remove timber species and assume that the timber species will regrow and other species won't take over, or vice versa. So he said this was combined with poor data, very poor monitoring, and the examples that he gives is one of the long-term increment plots that the forest departments had set up in the 1930s to monitor the growth of trees, and the kind of shabby state in which these plots were is actually been documented by foresters themselves in the 1980s. And the second example gives from the Bastar pine investigation that his committee was asked to do. So he points out that the original project was for 5,000 hectares, but they were asked to take it up on a pilot basis. So they did a much smaller area, about 50 hectares of clear felling and replacing with pine plantations. And that pilot was supposed to inform the larger project, which meant presumably that you would monitor what happens in that pilot plot. And so they went to find out what was the data that had been collected, and there was basically no data on what was going on in that pilot plot. It was assumed that, well, we'll do the pilot today and then we'll scale it up tomorrow, and we don't really have to worry about anything else. So that is a very classic example of very poor monitoring. And finally, when it comes to results, and this is something that Madhav was not able to do because the tree growth data were not so easily shared in many places when it came to selection felling. And also because selection felling, as I said, is a strategy that was employed a little bit later when clear felling was kind of considered not okay. So a PhD student of mine, Shruti Samanta's recent work, where she was lucky enough to get permission from the forest department to investigate the growth of trees in plots that are under selection felling, shows that really there is no regrowth. The graph is flat when the graph should be a rising graph, because trees felled in this plot, and then you look at plots which are 20 years past the felling point, and you're still not seeing any increase in the standing biomass in those plots. So really, what is predicted in these so-called stand tables, yield tables, and so on under the selection felling system is not coming about. And there could be a variety of reasons why it's happening. But this is something that the department itself, of course, has not studied, or if it has studied, then it has not revealed. Madhav's critique of scientific forestry had significant impacts. And the main impact was that clear felling was banned. And this is explicitly stated in the National Forest Policy of 1988. So the critique that they wrote in 1983 clearly had a palpable impact. Also, as a consequence of this, some states went a little bit further and completely banned green felling, as they call it, which is they will only fell in pre-existing plantations. They will not only not create new plantations through clear felling, but they will also not do selection felling. So we have some states which have also banned selection felling, and Karnataka is one of them. But, and so here comes the but, selection felling continues in several central Indian states in large quantities, as you can see from this photograph, which I took in the last few years in Bastar. And when you talk to foresters today as to why are you doing selection felling, even in the headwaters of the Narmada and so on, their response is felling is necessary to keep forests healthy. This has been, and we are doing scientific forestry, and our science dictates that this felling is necessary. So where is this actually coming from? Where is this statement coming from? And it's coming from a sort of textbook story that forestry or silvicultural books tell the foresters in their whatever 1 year of training that they get in the IFS, which is that this is the growth curve of timber in the forest, and therefore, if you want to maximize timber production, which is on the y-axis, then the forest should not be mature, which would be at the extreme end of the graph. It should be somewhere in the midpoint. So you need a sort of middle-aged forest to capture the point where maximum growth rates occur. Because as the forest gets older, the rate of timber production, actually, the net available timber production goes down. And to the extent that this graph even holds for Indian forests, you might say that is true. But on the other hand, if you plotted the graph of net primary production, which is a different definition of production that ecologists have been tracking and been interested in for a very long time, the graph goes very differently. And the graph actually peaks at the maximum stock size, which is in a sense the climax of the forest, when net primary production is maximum, but the harvestable increment of timber is zero. Why? Because as much timber that is growing is falling down in terms of tree mortality and leaf mortality, branch mortality, and so on. Because the forest is a completely mature forest. And so it's doing a huge amount of net primary production, but all that production is also equal to the mortality of different parts of the forest. And if you look for some other definition of production, maybe let's say the production of grass in the forest, it might peak even earlier than this mid-peak, because you need a forest which is open, where the canopy is fairly open for the grass production to be maximized. So then you would actually draw this graph differently. So therefore, there is no single definition of what is a useful or a healthy or a maximally yielding forest, because it depends on what yield you're looking for or what your management objectives are, and that would determine what kind of a harvesting or non-harvesting strategy you would follow, or what kind of forest you would consider desirable. So that's really been a point that Madhav has made. It's repeated in more clarity in the book that they wrote together, the Orchard Land. And subsequently, several of us have made this point that the question of scientific forestry does not tell you anything about the goals of forestry. Because you can scientifically grow forestry, manage forests for timber, you can equally scientifically manage forests for something else. And so do not impose one single notion of scientific forestry in terms of the question of what goal should be used. However, we haven't been able to break the hegemony of the foresters, neither on the goals nor on the science of forestry. And this letter on the left-hand side is a recent 2026 January, written by the DFO of Kanker Forest Division, replying to a notice from the collector, where the collector points out that villagers are complaining that where they have received community forest rights, the forest department continues to want to come in and do felling. And the villagers have passed resolutions opposing that felling, to which the DFO replies saying, our working plans have been approved by the Ministry of Environment in Delhi by letter number so and so, and therefore our working plans shall prevail. And if you push them on why they want to do that, they will go back to this felling is scientifically mandated argument, even it's the headwaters of the Narmada or the Mahanadi or whatever, wherever the forest might be. And so the question that I have asked them, to which then they have no answer, is that if felling is always scientifically mandated, then banning of felling in wildlife sanctuaries and national parks, which, as you know, there is no felling happening in these protected areas, should be called unscientific. So are you going to call that unscientific? So then most DFOs will say, no, but that's because that's a different goal there. So if that is a different goal, allows you to do a different kind of management and be equally scientific about it, then why can't you do the same thing with community forests and say that timber working plans written in a period when communities didn't have rights are no longer relevant or useful when communities have rights and want to manage forests differently. And of course, the larger question of why is the monopoly on what is a scientific prescription for a particular objective only the domain of the forest department. Because if you really look at what's going on in the name of even the method of scientific forestry, not just the objectives, you would expect, our definition of scientific as we understand in this room would be where the data are open access, the data are verifiable, the results should be replicable, and the findings should be subjected to independent peer review. none of these conditions are met when it comes to the working plans or the estimates of the forest department. In fact, till very recently, almost in no state forest department put its working plans in the public domain. It's only begun to put that out in the recent last few years in a few states. But of course, they are written in such jargon that nobody will be able to understand. The ones in Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh are written in Hindi, which is a translated Hindi using some, I don't know what algorithm they use. I don't think they themselves understand what they're writing in those plans. More importantly, and I think this is really important for us to understand, that poor scientific practice doesn't just happen. It happens because it is embedded in a particular institutional setup. And the setup here is about who can practice the science, how they can practice it, and where. So the practitioners of this science are not trained scientists, they are not trained researchers, they're not even trained foresters. Because a 1-year training program for the IFS trainees, you can imagine, is, if you look at the profile of Indian Forest Service officers graduating from IGNFA in the last 10 years, 2/3 or 3/4 of them are engineers. And I can curse them because I'm also an engineer. So then by training. So I can actually curse their fact that they probably never visited the forest. They wouldn't know what a forest is till it hit them in the face. And they not necessarily joined the IFS because they have a deep interest in forestry, forest ecology, or forest management. More importantly, the research institutes that are owned by the Ministry of Environment and Forests are invariably run by forest officers. And there have been court cases about this and so on and so forth. I won't bore you with the details. And for the independent researchers, whether they sit in NIAS, Indian Institute of Science, ATRI, or umpteen other independent research institutes, the ability to enter reserve forests and do any research, let alone on selection felling or anything else, is controlled by research permission or research permits, which, as many of you try to get those permits, know the kind of song and dance you have to go through in order to get these permissions, which can be revoked at any time. You might have the piece of paper to do, for example, in ITRI's case, experimental fire research in BR Hills, and then be denied the permission on the ground by the DFO, saying, I don't care if the PCCA Wildlife has given you this permission, but I'm not going to allow you to set fire to these experimental plots. So that's the kind of non-research that is happening in the bulk of our forested landscape. And that really constrains the quality of the work that will go, or the inputs, knowledge inputs that will go into forestry. So the question is that this problem has not been resolved. Yes, clear felling was stopped. Some places green felling has been stopped. But this larger question of how forests are managed and by whom and what knowledge goes into the management of forests is really burning. And as I said, in the central landscape, fellings are still very much happening. And the people who are standing up against this hegemony right now are some communities that have received community forest rights. They are going to the collector, protesting. The one example I gave you from Kanker, this example is from Bastar. And as you can see in the subtitle, Nangur ke Graminon par FIR ki dhamki. So the DFOs are responding by threatening to file FIRs or arrest these protesting villagers, saying you are coming in the way of a state-sanctioned working plan, a nationally sanctioned working plan. You're coming in the way of the execution of work by government officers, and therefore you can be arrested and put behind bars. So that's the state we are vis-a-vis scientific forestry today, in spite of the path-breaking work that Madhav did in the 1980s. And therefore, I feel that we need to resurrect, expand, and elaborate on the critiques of scientific forestry and stand along with these villagers in their resistance to the imposition of a single objective, which is timber felling, and the shoving of a certain knowledge system down their throat when they have a different knowledge system better adapted to their particular objectives, which is non-timber forest products, grazing, firewood collection, etc., that they would like to manage the forest for. The second example I want to pick up is about biodiversity conservation. And I can never start talking about Madhav's contribution to biodiversity without showing this article that he wrote. I think it's an example of his quick-wittedness, his ability to capture the essence of the problem and to raise questions in a very simple language. He asks, why conserve living biodiversity? And then he goes on to discuss 3 different responses to this question: the deep ecology response, the ecosystem services response, and then his own reply to that question. And so if I were to actually look at what Madhav's sort of contribution has been in this area, it's been to all the three questions. What is the biodiversity that we should be worried about? Why we should worry about it? And how we should conserve it? On the what question, he has contrasted his own position vis-a-vis the large mammal guys, as we often call some of the wildlife conservation groups. He said that plant diversity is also important, and in some writings has said that it is actually more important than large mammals. Why conserve this kind of diversity? The conventional response has been the aesthetic value of these animals, or now more recently the talk of rights of tigers and the rights of deer and so on. Um, then added to which is the utilitarian argument of ecosystem services, saying you save the tiger, you save the deer from overgrazing the forest, therefore you've saved the forest, therefore you've saved the hydrological services of the forest, therefore you will have a flowing river downstream. That's been kind of the very instrumental argument that has been put forth. And Madhav was one of the first to criticize the kind of instrumental and very narrow nature of this argument. And his arguments have been more, and they have changed over time, or they had changed over time. Initially, he talked about the cultural traditions of conservation. Then he talked about use value. In the work later on, he's talked very specifically about the genetic value and the need to protect people's intellectual property rights. And in this 1998 piece, actually, he talks about the elevation of the human spirit as the main reason to conserve biodiversity. And then how would you conserve it? He contrasts the large mammal approach, which is large protected areas, exclude humans completely, but of course allow tourists to still enter those protected areas, and do big science in terms of, again, focusing on these large areas, large mammals, and the kind of science you need for that. Whereas his approach was of distributed networks, of even the smallest possible sacred groves and so on, inclusive conservation, participatory assessments, and therefore his work on people's biodiversity registers, as many of you would know. And one of the reasons he wanted to push the idea of people's biodiversity registers was the idea that if you put people's knowledge in the public domain, then it could not be patented. It would be sort of out there, recorded, and then if it's knowledge in the public domain, it prevents that from being patented. But he realized that in many situations, especially in today's context, people would not be able to conserve or be willing to conserve all the biodiversity in their neighborhood unless they were also given some economic incentives. Now, these policy prescriptions that emerged from that also probably had some limitations. The policy prescriptions which are embedded in the Biodiversity Act that was passed in 2002 is about setting up biodiversity monitoring committees at the Gram Panchayat level, creating biodiversity registers, creating national level databases and tracking and verification of this knowledge that is in each register, and then setting up access and benefit sharing mechanisms. And more recently, as some of you will remember, he was considered to be making some very controversial statements, such as repeal the Wildlife Act because it is anti-constitutional, and permit the culling of wildlife where the wildlife is very harmful to agriculture and human life. Now, he was very happy when the Biodiversity Act was passed. I've read some of his writings where he's really making an argument, saying that this is a path-breaking law and we have a lot of work in front of us to, carry it forward. But what has transpired is much less than perfect in terms of the intent behind this whole thing. And some of it you could actually say are the flaws in the design itself of what he proposed and what lacuna there are in the proposal itself. And I'll give you one example, which is the formation of biodiversity management committees at the Gram Panchayat level. So A, the Gram Panchayat is too coarse a unit at which to form these committees. B, the Act gives them no jurisdiction over the real repository of biodiversity, which is the forest, because that part of the landscape still very much remained in the control of the Forest Department, because Gram Panchayats under Indian Panchayat Raj Acts do not control forests. So until you come to the provisions of the Forest Rights Act in 2006, you do not really have the capacity to manage the forests and manage the biodiversity in those forests with these committees. But we need to remember, even if we disagree with all the proposals that were embedded in the Biodiversity Act, whether because they're impractical or whether because maybe they are also flawed at some level, the hegemony of fortress conservation continues and in fact is expanding. So I ran into this news item on the 2047 vision of the Madhya Pradesh Forest Department. टाइगर रिजर्व नेशनल पार्कों से हटेगी आबादी, 500 गांव होंगे विस्थापित. And the language that is used is not just visthapan, it is about making all tiger reserves free of human presence. So you can see, normally we talk about free from oppression of human beings, people free from caste oppression, people free from gender oppression. Now this language of freedom is being used as tiger reserves free from human presence. And of course, the exception again remains that this presence is to be completely allowed and in fact encouraged as these tiger reserves are created and 500 villages are displaced. So not only do we have an expanding fortress conservation, but we now have what I am calling a toxic masculine conservation. And why I call it beyond fortress conservation as toxic and masculine is because of this notion that we can shape the wildlife landscape at will. If there are no tigers in this tiger reserve that we declared yesterday, we'll bring tigers from Kanha or somewhere else and put them in the tiger reserve. Then it will be justified calling it a tiger reserve. Then we'll bring rhinos from Assam and release them somewhere in Madhya Pradesh. Then we will bring, other deer or whatever else is required to make the landscape wild for us and for the tourists. And the latest example, of course, is the cheetah project, which was the cheetahs brought from Africa in this plain. So to me, this is beyond just conservation. If you look at the Wildlife Act, there are no provisions to actually reintroduce species in new landscapes or landscapes from which they have disappeared 100 years ago or 50 years ago. There is absolutely no provision in the Wildlife Act for that. Nevertheless, the wildlife conservation community and the forest departments are now going down this path, which is beyond just the issue of evicting people from existing areas that are populated by tigers. You're creating new reserves with no tigers, kicking out people, and then bringing in tigers. So how do we build on Madhav's core message of conservation with social justice, which is, I think, what we distill from all his work on biodiversity conservation. Whereas his earlier work focused heavily on documentation as a way to manage, I would argue that the real focus has to be on management itself. And he came around to that by working with communities under the Forest Rights Act on community forest management. If the biodiversity management committees are not empowered to manage their forest, we should move the locus of management to the Gram Sabhas, which do have that right under the Forest Rights Act. We should be looking at financial support on a pro rata basis as a right of these Gram Sabhas to have a share in the funds that go to the forest department, in proportion to the lands that they manage or the areas that they manage. If you do not want to repeal the Wildlife Act, then at least implement the 2007 amended version of this act in its true spirit, because that allows a lot of space for communities to coexist with whether it is tigers or wildlife in general. And so what we need really, I feel, is a campaign for community-based governance of protected areas, not just of other forests, but also of protected areas in a similar bottom-up manner as the Forest Rights Act requires. And as the evidence comes from BRLs or other locations, there is no reason to a priori assume that human presence is deleterious to wildlife. There is the BRLs is a classic example where tiger numbers have gone up after communities have received rights under the FRA. Finally and briefly, let me come to the question of or the idea of eco-development. This is a short period in Madhav's work where he went beyond forests, went beyond diversity, and triggered by the encounters he had with agriculturalists of Uttar Kannada during the anti-Bedti Dam movement in 1980 to 1983, looked at the landscape and concluded that the biomass resources as a whole, including the forests as well as the cultivated lands, were degrading due to expanding human pressure, and proposed a series of technological interventions as solutions. And the technological interventions included from IICs, the different work that was happening in Astra, smokeless chulas, biogas plants, improved fodder varieties in plots, stall feeding of crossbreed cows. They had BIF involved even in those days, and an experimental solar pond that was tried out in Kumta. So these are just some of the technologies that were promoted as part of this idea of eco-development of microcatchments, as the project was called. They had chosen 5 areas in Uttar Kannada for this experimental work. At the same time, Madhav was writing at a wider scale for eco-development of the Western Ghats and talking about the need to promote micro-hydel instead of large dams, to promote eco-friendly agriculture, to promote handicrafts, fishing, provide basic transport facilities, health and education facilities for these remote areas, rather than all the funds being spent in urban areas on development. So that was his vision. He's writing in 1984, 87, 89. One of them published in the Karnataka State of Environment report. There are, of course, limitations to the work that happened and the outcomes that came. This was a 5-year project. It was funded by the government of Karnataka and implemented by the government of Karnataka, with KSCST and CES playing a role of monitors rather than having given the original design. So in the implementation, they had very little control of what actually happened, which pieces of work were taken up and which were not. And of course, as you know, even if implementation were in their hands, for us scientists, it's easy to propose solutions. It's much harder to actually make those solutions work on the ground in the complexity of a rural landscape. I would go further and say that some of the diagnoses and therefore the prescriptions that were embedded in this plan were faulty. There was assumptions about degradation where there wasn't degradation, as some of my work showed later on. The solutions were exclusively technological, and that comes with its own set of social conditions under which technology will succeed and who it will succeed for. And this was a particular problem there, that, for example, the biogas plants were adopted only by the elite in the villages who could afford to stall feed their cows and had enough fodder in their captive fodder plots to feed those cows in the stalls, and so on and so forth. It also assumed a homogeneous village community, which certainly doesn't exist in Uttar Kannada. It might exist in some of the pure Adivasi villages, but even there you have to take that with a pinch of salt. There wasn't enough bandwidth in this project to look at questions of, say, agriculture, water, hydropower, and so on. And the focus, perhaps driven by the fact that he was a botanist coming from the Center for Ecological Sciences, the focus was on biomass. So the assumption is that you can manage all developmental needs by improving the productivity of biotic resources and not really tapping into abiotic resources. It could be anything. It could be local small mines, quarries. It could be larger mines, and so on. And of course, other industrial products that today we take for granted in our lifestyle in urban or even rural areas. So the idea that abiotic resources might actually be the driver of development is something completely left out of the picture. Much later, however, Madhav has come back to this idea of eco-development in a couple of different ways. One is focusing much more on democratic institutions and empowering those institutions to manage their resources in the way they want, and that's the work that he's done in Eastern Maharashtra with the Gram Sabhas. Of course, choosing perhaps consciously more homogeneous Adivasi communities in that case. But also coming to the question of abiotic, saying that we cannot really visualize development purely based on biomass resources. We are all using abiotic resources. The chairs in this room, the microphone that I'm using, or the laptop, and so on, are all made from our industrial products, coming largely from an industrial economy that taps into minerals, metals, and fossil fuels. And so what do we do about that? Can we just wish it away? And so he came back to this question by proposing the idea of cooperative mining in Goa as a response to, or as an alternative to, large capital-driven mines that has been a source of large controversy in that state. So how can we take this idea forward? We need to reimagine development, or his idea of eco-development, in today's context. And I think we need to begin by more clearly distinguishing our concerns. Because very often we stumble on what we really mean by good development. And I think it's useful to have at least a five-fold classification or a five-fold notion of what we mean by good development. Is development that, of course, enhances and maintains a certain level of human well-being, does it in an equitable and just fashion, both environmentally and socially speaking. Of course, also has some concern for the well-being of non-humans and the well-being of future generations through the idea of sustainability. But it also arrives at these decisions about which developmental trajectory to adopt and how to actually go about this process through a democratic process, decision-making process. And I think all of these need to be fundamental goals, not one as a means to the other. So we should not be thinking of democratic functioning as a means to achieving, say, conservation by calling it participatory conservation, because that means when we don't achieve it through democratic means, then we discard the democratic process, which would not be the right way to go about it. And we need to move away from the idea of sort of, a biocentric idea. And I don't mean biocentrism in the deep ecology sense, but a linked idea that we can solve all problems by doing nature-based solutions, by paying people for delivering ecosystem services, by doing carbon credits, where we'll solve the world's climate change problem by planting more trees, mostly in the global south. So I think we need to move away again from these biocentric solutions to the problems that have been created by the industrial revolution. And therefore engage with all sectors, not just Jal Jungle Zameen, but also beyond. And that beyond would mean forest, water, but minerals, industry, trade, and governance as areas in which we need very serious decentralization. So the ownership of minerals would also, which I think something that Madhav had already proposed, major minerals should also rest with local communities, and they can mine at their own pace, in their own style, rather than be dependent upon others to come in and do the mining and take it forward. Why just mining? What about the industry that follows from the mining? What about the business that follows from the industry, and so on? And finally, I would say eco-development for people in this room begins at home. We have to stop the sort of predatory urban elite extraction of resources from the hinterland. And it's not just resources, as COVID told us, it is also the labor that we don't see, but is actually transiting millions through the urban landscape and providing us with the kind of lifestyle that we are all enjoying. So I think this reimagination of what eco-development means in today's context is really important. And to do that, finally, I would say we need to create a public science and engineering. And I'm just picking up this slide from a lecture I gave in the honor of Madhav Gadgil's father, Dhananjay Rao Gadgil, where I said that the science that is not fragmented along disciplinary lines, not measured by citation indices and journal impact factors, but by the impact it creates on people's lives, supported by government but not controlled by bureaucrats or donors, answerable to the public and to the constitutional vision, and inclusive of laypersons and craftspersons' knowledge, not separating the Shastri from the Maestri, as one would say, or the hand from the head, is an essential part of the kind of science and engineering that we should be promoting towards this eco-development idea. That, I think, would be the best tribute we could pay to Madhav Gadgil. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for the nice perspective. But two thoughts came to my mind. One is by asking the local communities to manage, how are we sure that they will really preserve it? Because they're also going through a change. The other thing is that, I mean, how is it this being managed in other countries? Is it specific to Indian problems, or generally this is an issue there with all other countries? And one of your comment about bringing back the other species like cheetahs coming, is it a political statement, or is it against conservation that we want to revive the old species which are lost?
You asked a number of different questions. So I think my answer to the first one, which is what happens when you devolve power to local communities, is in some ways the easiest one to answer, because, as I said, it depends upon our normative commitment to the idea of democracy. Because by definition, in democracy, there is the risk that people will democratically decide to commit suicide. And I think people have a right to do that at some level, at least. And when we say, what will happen when the power is devolved to them, what we are really saying, what will happen when my power is devolved to them? And I think that's a problem, because they have a right to take decisions about their natural environment, in a democratic country. And therefore, they should have the major say in what happens. And we should also recognize the level of colonial structures that we still live in. Yeah.
They remain the same
No,
they were
there is
before.
no such assumption.
So that
there is no such assumption. So that's why I'm saying my own personal shift, and I think it was also true for Madhav, over sort of 20, 30 years of engaging in this space, when I started doing my PhD work on forests and later on this whole issue of joint forest management, participatory forestry, and so on, I was still basically an environmentalist who cared about the outcome. That I want better management of forests, I want deforestation to reduce, and so on. And if participation, local participation leads to that outcome, I'm in favor of local participation. The flip side of that is if it doesn't lead to that outcome, I will jettison the idea of participation immediately. It took me a while to realize that the problem in that position, where participation is an instrument. And if I say it's a democratic right, then that's a different way of thinking about it. Your second point about whether it's just this country or a wider problem. So I think it's a problem in all post-colonial societies, more than it's a problem. This is not to say that we don't have problems of centralization of economic and political power in the quote unquote global north or the quote unquote developed world, but certainly it's a much bigger problem in post-colonial countries because that colonial legacy of controlling people still remains. And we just have to look at our own bureaucratic structure where the collector was, in the colonial period, a white guy who controlled the entire bureaucracy with the role of extracting revenue from the agricultural communities, and therefore had, in order to be able to extract revenue, had the power of a magistrate and control the police force. This is a colonial construct, that one bureaucrat has the power to order the police to beat up people who don't pay revenue, and is the district magistrate who will sit on judgment also. So he's judge and executioner, everything rolled into one. This is a completely colonial and anti-democratic concept. We still haven't abandoned that even 75, 80 years post-independence. So I think most post-colonial societies will have a huge amount of this legacy. I'm sorry, I forgot your third question. Oh, the cheetah. So I think the question is less to me about what specifically species you bring back, and this idea of bringing back cheetah was there 100 years ago, so we should have it now. But how we arrived at that decision in the first place. As you said, it's a political statement. It's not critical to conservation. Then what is it really for? Because it's not done in consultation with local communities. You are just treating the Kuno National Park as a playground. Originally meant for the lion to be brought from Gujarat, because we needed at least one other place where the lion would flourish. Otherwise it'll breed too much inbreeding in the Gir. And what do? Gujarat doesn't want to let go of its lions, so you bring in the cheetahs from Zimbabwe. I mean, it's just an amazing sort of perversion of the idea of conservation, right? So it's neither participatory nor particularly, to my mind, conservation oriented. It's basically yes, it's a political statement. Yeah.
Hello, am I audible? So my name is Gaurav. My question is the idea of eco-development that is being talked about. The way the scientific forestry or colonial forestry happened in India, the idea of forest conservation was pushed with an exclusionary paradigm of conservation. So when people were removed from these protected areas through voluntary rehabilitations, and they're displaced and turned into conservation refugees in different landscapes. So, and that was presented in different working plans of forest institutions in India as a eco-development project. And currently the trend as it goes, it's towards the ecotourism village, or for the change of colonial forest villages to ecotourism villages. So how do we visualize eco-development in this perspective from the ideas of Professor Gadgil?
Thank you for asking this question, because I forgot to make this clarification. Madhav's idea of eco-development is for the whole district, for the whole state, for the whole nation. It's not about eco-development of fringe villages of protected areas. It sort of shows you the power of co-option of terms. So the World Bank comes in and decides that eco-development is about just the villages on the fringe of protected areas and giving them some financial packages as compensation for being told not to go into the tiger reserve and pursue their livelihoods. So eco-development committees set up in the fringes of protected areas is a very different notion. It's about keeping people out of protected areas. Madhav's idea of eco-development had nothing to do with this whole thing. Neither is mine. When I'm talking about eco-development, I'm talking about the whole developmental trajectory of the entire landscape, the entire, as I said, district, state, whatever. So they're just two very different things. This eco-development of forest fringe villages or PA fringe villages through eco-development committees is started as a World Bank funded project to, as I said, keep people out of protected areas. So it's a complete perversion of the idea of eco-development, if I may say so.
How do we visualize eco-development in these protected areas, these villages then?
Like so we should be visualizing in the same way as the rest of the landscape. If for some reason we see these as more conservation priority or more important from a conservation perspective, the question is, will people's current management plans come in the way of conservation, or are there some tweaks that are required to get them an alternative livelihood? But that's something that they should be part of decision making. The idea of co-management or co-governance of protected areas is that they will collectively decide, along with outside stakeholders, what's the best way to manage these landscapes.
Thank you, Professor. I came to listen to you and it was a fabulous talk. I have a couple of questions regarding the reason of failure of certain plans and policy implications. You highlighted several points like inadequate funding, then wrong theorization of the problem, and so on and so forth. 5 reasons you said. Sir, would you also partially agree with me that we, as a diverse democratic country, also lack the basic common minimum discipline in several aspects, and until and unless that common minimum discipline is ensured, the outcome also is going to be always very problematic, because you can make a plan, but through people how it gets actually transmitted or implemented, that is very variable. And then again the moral thing will come, that who are you to tell that how should people behave, but common minimum discipline possibly is required, looking at some of the advanced country. Your take on that. And second question is, you talked about inadequately educated people actually running the total forest administration. Do you have any idea how to streamline this authorization power or authority so that the better outcomes can be actually devised or maybe conceptualized? Some structural changes, like who will be like one window clearance of this thing, so on and so forth. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just mention this to the online participant. Joy, we'll come back to you in the next question. Please hold on for a second. So your first question, I think we should look at it very differently. It's people's behavior is hugely shaped by the structure of incentives and disincentives in which they are embedded, the institutions in which they are embedded, the value systems, as well as the the norms that are driving that behavior. So we should ask the question, and as you said rightly, who are we to make plans for other people? So the question is, what will enable people to make their own plans? They need to have jurisdiction over the resources which the FRA gives them. I'm now very specifically talking about forests. We know that we don't have a Water Rights Act, so we don't have similar capacities for people to take collective decisions about water. For example, groundwater depletion is a major issue in many parts of the country. But we need similar kind of enabling legislation which enables people to regulate their own resources in a collective manner. And then the question is, well, if some people choose not to regulate, you will have to live with that. Because again, the idea is not to force certain things down their throat. There may be external stakeholders who set some minimum expectations or something of that kind in certain contexts. For example, in the case of water, you would have to ensure that a certain amount of water flows downstream, because there are downstream people who have some rights. But otherwise, you will have to leave it to local communities to figure out what plans work best for them. And there's no guarantees, given the nature of Indian society, or probably any society, in terms of inequalities of class, caste, gender, and so on. We have a long way to go before we can say that these communities will be truly democratic. But that's the larger challenge that all of us have to rise up to it. Rather than look at it as a question of they are indisciplined and I am disciplined, I think we might want to engage it in a very bottom-up manner. Yeah. Your second point about the what kind of a structure. So I feel, Mao said that power flows from the barrel of a gun, where in the Indian context, certainly for the forest department, they hold the gun and they hold the legal authority over the landscape. And the legal authority, as I pointed out, stretches all the way to knowledge production. That no one else shall enter that landscape for knowledge production except with their permission. And you should see some of the research permits that are given out, where they require, 6 monthly reports, co-authorship by a DFO of that report. Nothing shall be published without our permission and it being presented to us. It's unbelievable that we think we are living in a democratic country, right? So I think the only way you can dismantle that is by changing their powers. It is not so much about their education. It is first and foremost about their powers. When they feel the need for education, they will figure out a way to get that education. But they don't feel the need for, actually arming them with any particular education, except knowing their powers of arrest that they exercise over the tribal population all the time. So I think we have to really, what the FRA does to a large extent is to say that the jurisdiction of Gram Sabhas in their community forest resource will prevail over the working plans of the forest department. Now, once they have lost 80% of their landscape, things will change automatically. Is my sense. Sorry, I'll take the questions online first, if you don't mind. Joy, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sharad. I really enjoyed the talk, and I mostly agree with whatever you said. I hope I'm audible to you.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And especially where you stopped saying that we need to reimagine eco-development and the couple of slides you brought in and things. So I just want comment and maybe a question and a small suggestion is how do you take this forward? One is that I think in terms of, Madhav's contribution to analyzing societies or different things. And I think the other day I was telling you some of the ideas which I picked up. Probably today's your talk may not have dealt with that. Is that earlier we used to talk about this Marxian idea of mode of production as an important way of looking at the different societies and things, how mode of production, distribution, consumption takes place. So the whole idea of mode of resource use, though it was implicit in the early idea, I think Madhav and Guha has made it much more explicit. So probably, combining these two, this probably it will get a better handle to look at the changing societies and other type of thing. I think this is something which I think as, whether it is academic or an activist who are involved in the whole project of transformation, probably need to engage with. The second thing is that where you stop and how do you take that process ahead? When you say that we need to create, this, reimagine eco-development in a particular way that we have suggested, what are the first steps involved in that? I mean, I would say that unless the concerned academics and people in the social movements come together, one, to create this new imagination, and also how do you get on with the wherewithal of that in terms of, creating this new knowledge, looking at things, developing the required skills to do it and things, an important thing. I think that is where Madhav's contribution really comes in. I think he worked very closely with the social movement, and I can say this from Maharashtra experience. Whenever we were called him for any meeting, suggestions, then he was always there. So I think today that space is shrinking. So how do you create? And there, I would say the onus should be more in the court of the academic community or the institutional spaces you people have, where you can bring in these more conversations, dialogues, and create a new, imagine as well as the how do you ground that. So that's my suggestion. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. I don't really have much to add except to endorse your last point. I'm in a room which is predominantly of academics, I would say, and therefore, as Joy rightly points out, the onus is on us to again re-engage with people on the ground as well as create those spaces where this engagement can fructify into something useful. Thank you, Joy.
Yeah.
Actually, my journey towards ecology began at the other end of the spectrum, where you ended with saying that as urbans we live a predatory life. And somewhere when I got exposed to Narmada Bachao Andolan and the development versus displacement debate. So then I found myself thinking that where am I with respect to all this? So then this concern came that how do I live my life without destroying society or exploiting people? So initially I thought I'll do some book exhibitions and sales, because those days I was helping to set up libraries. So at that time when I took these books to village schools where people were displaced and all. We ran very well as a one-day exhibition, but there was no buying power. So another thing I realized is that for livelihood, if we are serving the rich with the most unnecessary luxury, we will certainly make money. But when it is serving the most necessary things with the poor, we won't be able to. So with that, I moved to farming. Now, when I started farming, one initial question was this whole thing of economic identity. So when I started farming, I didn't have money. I raised money from friends and all and started farming. Then I realized that not all lands are productive, but every land needs to be tended. So somewhere I started feeling that, society should support, or how do we, I mean, the concern still exists that how do we make a society which makes conservation possible? So this, when I developed further, like, okay, initially we grew trees and we raised exchange seeds and all that, but we found that unless the whole watershed is developed, then this land also cannot reach its what its potential is. So now over the years with farming and all, I've started also feeling that land cannot be developed as a individual property. The whole area needs to develop. So that means that now, ever since industrial revolution, we have all been schooled to think and function as individuals, whereas nature is not like that. Okay, because I ran into water problems, I made a rainwater harvesting roof and a sump, but I also feel that that is not a collective solution, and then tending water is a collective action. So somewhere it leads to this, that we all should live collectively, but it seems so difficult in current times. So even though I live in a village and all that, I know that they're putting pesticides and I still have no ground to go and talk with them and get this to correction to happen. So now it is, I feel that ever since industrial revolution, our whole social, economic, political structures are all geared for destruction. So it seems like we need to do a clean wipe. We all take up parts and try and do something. And I feel that is also like, repair work. One big problem is created as activists, as NGO. In a small way, we are able to small things. And also it is sort of so disconnected from our life. I may be living this life and I may be doing some corrections or helping with some correction somewhere. So these are the questions that I'm now living with, and I'm thinking that, okay, in a village, what needs to be done? So, okay, right now we are at this stage, no point saying that a person thinks this way, that way. That our ABCs that we learn should be to connect with our natural resources.
So we have a particular question, you might want to come to that. Yeah.
So actually Madhav's one thing that really, I read this book of his, Walk Up the Hill. So can we, right from the beginning, be engaged with and grow to learn about carrying capacity of the earth, of our area, and to learn to live within it. So in that sense, I felt that whatever he has done as, biodiversity management committees, I think if every child in every school starts with that, more than the, other subjects that we learn, and that we are engaged with our own environment, and our learning is for action, our knowledge is for action rather than for just whatever that we then move to. We never remain connected with any place.
Yeah.
So whether we can have a grounded existence. I'm sorry it went so long.
No.
I couldn't say that.
I don't disagree with most of what you said, except that I think what you have stated is the standard dilemma of the activist or any person who wants to try to make a difference, including probably a dilemma that Madhav faced. He may or may not have been. He was not the type to discuss those dilemmas, philosophically with colleagues. At least, certainly, I didn't hear him discuss these dilemmas. But everybody who intervenes in the world, has this contradiction between their lifestyle and what they are trying to promote. And that's, I think, something we have to just learn to live with and to collectively organize around in order to bring about a difference. I think the point being that we may live frugal lifestyles, but still not make the kind of impact till we have a certain amount of collective organization to change the structural conditions within which we are struggling, right? So Fair enough. So I think each person will have to choose their path forward in terms of what exactly they would call grounded, especially, and I just wanted to highlight that one point, which is that, yes, knowing biotic nature is definitely an entry point to thinking environmentally. And I would say that's true even for myself. I mean, being trained as an engineer, you're not exposed to that. It was my bird watching and wildlife interest that actually introduced me to some idea of environment, and later on it broadened into an overall understanding of the way in which different, both physical and biological parts of the of nature are connected with human well-being. But these entry points don't necessarily solve the whole story or sustain us all the way through, because we are all now enjoying the fruits of abiotic resource use, whether it's the lights here or the fans or the cement structure or the chairs we are sitting on and so on. And so it's easy for us to say we should be live close to nature, because that code nature, there is a code word for biotic nature. But we would just be skipping over the whole challenge of how do we also inculcate the abiotic elements without destroying the world as we are today through climate change. I mean, what did fossil fuel use do? In the short run, gave us a whole bunch of goodies and actually reduced drudgery in certain ways, but has also resulted in climate change. So how do we, the challenge is going to be to balance that, not to, in a sense, run away from it. Yeah. Just 1 second, there's another mic. Yeah, please go. I'll just take your question after that. Yeah, just 1 second. Yeah, go ahead.
Shall I? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Lily. I had a specific question about the forestry curve that you showed about logging. So I was in conversation with Professor C.N. Pandey, who was a professor of practice at IIT Gandhinagar, was a former PCCF of Gujarat. And we had a long conversation about participatory management and where do you draw your working plans from. And then he said that not all states abide by what they were taught. Not all PCCFs abide by the knowledge that comes from the college, and that they have independent thinking, they have independence to modify what they have been taught and act with freedom. And he said that in his own efforts, that he had gone around 2 tribal collectives in Gujarat and collected information about fire management, grassland management, and so on, and that all of these were incorporated in the working plans for Gujarat, for example. So I just wanted to ask, what is the level of independence that each of these states has in changing these working plans? So these theoretical graphs that you showed about logging in Narmada headlands, for example, in what is the status for these various states, and why can't we change these theoretical underpinnings with more knowledge, and where do we stand when it comes to that, about changing these so-called archaic graphs from textbooks that they are being educated on? Thank you.
So on paper, there is always a lot of leeway, and they will have these, they can modify as per local conditions, etc. Question is what happens in practice, and you will see that in fact, the Supreme Court is part of the problem, because they are trying to impose a standardized jurisdiction across the whole country. The idea of a national working plan code and approval from the central government for working plans is the Supreme Court's idea in the Godavarman case. It is not originally in the Forest Conservation Act itself. So centralization will invariably lead to uniform, practices which will be less sensitive to local context. That is number one, right? Number two, there is still a refusal to acknowledge the difference between objectives and difference between methods. So if your objective is not timber production, then this whole silvicultural knowledge itself is irrelevant. You might pick up the idea of fire control from the tribals of the Dangs, but you're still applying it to improve timber production in your forests, then you're still basically stuck with the same objective. And in fact, Ram Guha's work on scientific forestry in Uttarakhand is the obverse of what Madhav is saying to some extent. What he's pointing out is the British foresters were really smart. They were really scientific in the way they used knowledge to control the landscape for their benefit. For example, promoting fire in order to promote Devdar regeneration that doesn't otherwise, grow very well or very profusely in natural forests. So they targeted species and did what was necessary to promote those species. It's sort of the flip side of saying that they had the knowledge, or they developed the knowledge over time to do these manipulations and changed and adapted as they went along. So it was actually very scientific, but for the wrong purpose, you can say, or a purpose that served the colonial masters and not the local communities. So I think this distinction between what are the objectives and then what are the methods And what would make the methods robust would still be following good scientific practice, which is transparency, verifiability, independent verification, peer review. All that still holds. I mean, it might be one PCCF who's good enough to do it on his own, but you could have other PCCF incorporating the wrong practices, and then the only way you can prevent that is through peer review. Is my overall sense here. Thanks.
Nice lecture, sir. This is Dr. Pasha, working on natural resource management using geospatial and interdisciplinary work. Sir, I have a doubt. Actually, this Western Ghat Ecological Expert Committee led by this sir and subsequent eco-sensitive zones which prepared, that is 15 to 20 years old data as they used. And now forest structure, composition, demography, and topology, everything has changed over the past 2 decades. How the earlier data will be useful for the current and as well as the future sustainability? That is the question. Because of the computational power and the space technology and the earth observation data is available, we need to integrate to redesigning of eco-sensitive zones. That is the concern.
So, since I'm a user of geospatial data myself, as well as some amount of empirical ecological data, I've always struggled with the fact that the larger debate is really not about the data, and the larger debate is not going to be addressed by fine-tuning the data. I do not say that data don't go out of date and we need to update them. All that is perfectly valid, but those activities will solve 1% of the problem, is my submission to you. Because the real debates are still about, can we regulate development in the Western Ghats at all or not? It's very simple. I served on the expert appraisal committee for coal mining. There were data staring in our face, and yet the committee by majority overruled the idea of even looking at it at any great depth, in project after project. So very simple things like the company that is applying for an expansion of coal mining is already in violation of its existing environmental clearance conditions. The law says that you should not be giving them a new clearance till they have come into compliance with the old the clearance conditions in the old mine. And the committee is then doing all kinds of manipulation to say, we'll give them a conditional clearance, then we'll go and visit to see whether the conditions have been met or not. And I have too many stories of that kind to really worry so much about the tweaking or updating of data itself. And in the data, again, there are much bigger problems. Like if you look at, again, to take the example of coal mining or thermal power plants, invariably the air pollution monitors around thermal power plants are just within the 100 ppm or 60 ppm for PM 2.5, 60 ppm limit, always just within that limit. How come? You go to the field, then you realize what's really going on. I mean, monitors are shut off when it gets too polluted. In Delhi, for example, to reduce the AQI, they were spraying water in tankers around the points where AQI monitoring is happening. In this context, how important is the data debate per se, as against the conditions that are producing false data or wrong decisions, blatantly wrong decisions in the face of whatever is available. So I think without denying that we need to work on some data issues, we should be asking which are the biggest holes and which are the 1% of the problem. So just my submission.
Monitor, because whatever the mining you are saying, that all approved mining, not in the current government. For example, you see the hydrological projects in the Northeast that was approved 2000 year, but implemented in 2022. So it's not current one, but already approved project that need to be taken consideration for the ecology perspective, because it's already approved and people are evacuated. So some issues are there that need to be data refined using the spatially explicit time and space data. Thank you.
Sir, thank you for the enriching lecture. Yeah. So, one objective of our joint forest management was the knowledge co-creation, and which is mostly unachieved yet so far. Now, what are the provisions or ways of knowledge co-creation that is present in the forestry doctrine, and their limitations? Keeping that aside, do you think that a pedagogical scope to capture the heterogeneity at the spatial level or at the community level Will that be a way out? And this is a follow-up question. If so, now at the time when there is academically push for the centralization, do you think it's a good time for us who are in academia or who has some field research experience, we should raise our voice in doing so? Thank you.
So let me start by saying that I was also a big supporter of joint forest management when it first emerged in the 1990s, following the Arabari experiment in West Bengal, because at that time that was our level of understanding. But by 95, I had written a paper as to what is wrong with joint forest management, which later on I updated and published in an edited volume. Uh, the, the basic problem with joint forest management, as you know, is what you would call a three-legged race between a dwarf and a giant. Right? So you're tying the legs of a community to the leg of a giant called the forest department and expecting them to run together jointly. So that's a fundamentally flawed structural arrangement within which then co-creation has very limited space. Of course, again, you will always find some innovative bureaucrats who will, manage to do some amount of that, give a certain amount of leeway, be much more willing to sit on the same floor with Gram Sabhas and have conversations. But at the end of the day, it is a highly unequal relationship. The power remains with the forest department, and to accept or reject knowledge and so on. So it's not a level playing field. So I think that is a fundamental flaw in this whole arrangement. We need to figure out other platforms where we can have a more equal relationship or conversation or a dialogue. And I think the first and foremost requirement is who is the legal manager of that particular landscape. That changing that will change that power relationship. So I think that's my point number one. And you're right. I mean, in the context of increased centralization of many things, including environmental decision making, it is time that we all devoted our energies to strengthening both the grassroots level work that is happening in the spaces that are available, the protests where the spaces are closed, as well as trying to mobilize opinion at the larger public scale. It's not only about helping communities, because they also need support from larger society. So I think creating public opinion is part of our jobs as academics, that I think we should be also doing fearlessly without worrying about the consequences of every op-ed piece that we might write, because I think it's really becoming a case of self-censoring that is increasing in academia, where people are refusing to be explicit about their position on many of these environmental issues. Thank you.
So on that note, I think we're out of time. I would like to thank our speaker for coming today and sharing his very engaging lecture. Thanks to the audience for your participation, and good evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to the online community.